They said no one hurt her. When I showed them the bruises on my mother's arms, dark purple marks that wrapped around her wrists like handcuffs, parallel lines on her biceps that looked like they'd been stamped there with a ruler, the nursing staff at Meadowview Care Center looked me in the eye and told me my mother had thin skin and bumps into things. They documented it as senile purpura in her chart, a fancy medical term that means old person bruises easily. They made me feel like I was imagining things, like I was being a paranoid daughter who didn't understand that elderly people just bruise. But I'm not stupid, and I'm not paranoid, because when I measure the spacing between those parallel bruises and compared them to the metal bed rails on my mother's hospital bed, they matched exactly, down to the millimeter. Those weren't accidental bumps. Those were restraint marks. Someone had been holding my mother down, pressing her arms against those rails with enough force to leave bruises that looked like fingerprints of violence. And when I demanded answers, when I showed them the photographic evidence that their safety equipment had been used as a weapon against my helpless mother, they tried to cover it up with lies and medical jargon and threats about disrupting care. But the bruises don't lie. The measurements don't lie. And I wasn't going to let them gaslight me into believing that what I saw with my own eyes wasn't real. My mother's name is Dorothy Davis, but everyone has always called her Miss Dorothy or Mama Dot. She's 73 years old, a retired church secretary who spent 40 years typing bulletins, organizing potlucks, and keeping the Greater Faith Community Church running smoothly. She was the quiet strength behind every pastor who came through those doors, the woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who sent cards when people were sick, who showed up with casseroles when families were grieving. She was gentle and kind and soft-spoken, the type of woman who would apologize for being an inconvenience, even when she was the one helping you. 8 months ago, she had a stroke. A bad one. It stole her ability to speak clearly. She can make sounds, but words don't come out right anymore. It stole most of the movement on her right side, leaving her dependent on others for nearly everything. She can squeeze your hand, nod her head, move her left arm a little. But she can't walk, can't dress herself, can't tell you in words what she needs, or how she feels, or if someone is hurting her. She's trapped in a body that doesn't work anymore, with a mind that's still sharp but no voice to express what she knows. We moved her to Meadowview Care Center 3 months ago because the facility had a 5-star safety rating and promised specialized stroke rehabilitation. The admissions coordinator, a cheerful white woman named Karen, walked us through the security protocols, the fall prevention programs, the dignity-centered care model. She showed us the hospital beds with adjustable rails designed to keep residents safe, the call button systems, the staff badges that tracked every entry and exit from resident rooms. "Your mother will be completely protected here," she said. "We take safety very seriously. No one gets hurt on our watch." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her, because watching my vibrant mother become so helpless and vulnerable was destroying me, and I desperately wanted to trust that someone else could keep her safe when I couldn't be there 24 hours a day. The first few weeks seemed okay. Mama Da was quiet, but she'd been quiet since the stroke. She seemed tired, but rehabilitation is exhausting. I visited every day after work, helped her eat dinner, read to her from her favorite devotional books, held her hand while she drifted off to sleep. She'd squeeze my hand 3 times before I left, our private code for "I love you," and I'd leave feeling like maybe this was going to work out. Then I started noticing the fear. It was subtle at first. The way Mama Dot's body would tense when certain staff members entered the room. The way her eyes would track a particular aide. A young white woman named Brittany, with something that looked like terror. The way she gripped my hand tighter when I said I had to leave for the night, her eyes pleading with me not to go even though she couldn't form the words to ask me to stay. "Is something wrong, Mama?" I'd ask. She'd shake her head no, but her eyes said yes. Her whole body said yes. But without words, without the ability to point or gesture clearly, she couldn't tell me what was frightening her. And when I asked the staff if everything was okay, if my mother seemed anxious or upset, they'd smile and say she was doing fine, adjusting well, no problems at all. If you're watching this because you've noticed changes in your elderly loved one's behavior, unexplained fear, mysterious injuries, withdrawal, and the staff keeps telling you everything is fine even though your gut says something is very wrong, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on all notifications. Because what I'm about to tell you could save your parents' life. This is about recognizing the signs of abuse when your loved one can't speak for themselves, and what to do when facilities lie to cover up violence. And if this story resonates with you, if you've seen suspicious bruises or injuries that staff dismissed as normal, leave a heart in the comments below and tell me what city you're watching from. Let's build a community that protects our most vulnerable elders. The day everything changed was a Wednesday in late October. I'd come to visit Mama after work, around 6 p.m., carrying her favorite milkshake from the diner she used to love. When I walked into room 312, she was in bed, lying on her left side facing the window. The room was dim. Someone had closed the curtains even though Mama loved natural light, and she didn't turn to look at me when I came in. That was unusual. She always turned her head, always smiled when she saw me, always reached out her good hand for me to hold. "Mama," I said softly, approaching the bed, "I brought you a chocolate shake." She turned her head slowly, and I saw that she'd been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy, tears still wet on her cheeks. My heart clenched. "What's wrong? Are you in pain?" I pressed the call button for a nurse, then sat on the edge of the bed and took her left hand. She squeezed it hard, harder than usual, almost desperately. "Mama, what happened?" She made a sound, a frustrated, anguished noise that might have been words if the stroke hadn't stolen them. She gestured weakly toward her right arm with her good hand, and that's when I noticed it. Her right arm, the one affected by the stroke that she couldn't move well, was lying on top of the blanket, and it was covered in bruises, dark, angry purple marks that wrapped around her wrist. More bruises on her upper arm. Not random splotches like you'd get from bumping into furniture. These were specific, patterned, parallel lines of bruising that looked deliberate. "Oh my God!" I breathed, gently lifting her arm to look closer. Mama winced, and I realized the bruises were fresh, probably only a day or two old. "Who did this to you?" She made that frustrated sound again, tears spilling down her face. She couldn't tell me. She couldn't say who had hurt her or how it happened or when. All she could do was cry and squeeze my hand and trust that I would figure it out. A nurse finally responded to the call button, not the regular evening nurse I knew, but someone I hadn't seen before. A middle-aged white woman whose badge said Rachel RN. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone already defensive, like she was annoyed at being called. "Yes, you can help me by explaining these bruises on my mother's arm," I said, keeping my voice steady even though I wanted to scream. "These weren't here 2 days ago when I last visited. What happened?" Rachel came closer and looked at Mama Dot's arm with a casual glance that told me she already knew about the bruises. "Oh, those? Yes, we documented that. Your mother has very thin skin due to her age and her medications. She bumps into things, the bed rails, the wheelchair arms, the bathroom grab bars. Elderly patients bruise very easily. It's completely normal." "Normal," I repeated. "Look at these marks. These are random bumps. These are parallel lines. Look at the pattern." "Senile purpura," Rachel said dismissively. "It's a medical condition where elderly people develop bruising from very minor trauma. Sometimes they don't even remember bumping into anything. It looks worse than it is. My mother had a stroke. She can't move her right side well enough to bump into things with this arm. Someone would have to be moving her, handling her. So who was rough with her? Who grabbed her hard enough to leave these marks?" Rachel's expression hardened. "No one was rough with your mother. We provide excellent care here. The bruises are from her own movements during care, when we're helping her turn in bed, when we're transferring her to the wheelchair. Sometimes patients resist or move unpredictably, and they bump against equipment. It's unfortunate, but it happens. There's no need to be accusatory. I'm not being accusatory. I'm asking for an explanation for injuries that appeared on my mother's body while she was in your care. And I've given you one. If you have further concerns, you can schedule a meeting with our director of nursing. But I can assure you, no one hurt your mother. These bruises are accidental and unavoidable given her condition." She left before I could respond, and I sat there shaking with anger and fear. Because I knew in my gut that Rachel was lying. But I also knew that proving it would be nearly impossible. It was my word against theirs, my suspicions against their documented explanations, my mother's tears against their medical terminology. But then I looked at those bruises again, really looked at them, and I realized something that made my blood run cold. The parallel lines weren't random. They were evenly spaced, precisely measured, like they'd been made by something with uniform spacing. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos from every angle, making sure the spacing between the marks was clearly visible. Then I looked at the hospital bed's metal side rails, the rails that were supposed to keep Mama Dot from falling out of bed, that were supposed to keep her safe. The bed rails were made of metal bars running horizontally, with vertical support bars connecting them at regular intervals. I pulled out a small tape measure I kept in my purse, a habit from my years working in construction management, and measured the distance between the vertical bars. 3 inches, exactly 3 inches from center to center. Then I measured the distance between the parallel bruise lines on my mother's arm. 3 inches, exactly 3 inches. My hands were trembling as I took more photos, close-ups of the bruises, wide shots showing the bed rails in the frame, measurements with the tape measure clearly visible. The pattern was undeniable. The bruises on my mother's arm matched the spacing of the bed rails perfectly. This wasn't from accidentally bumping into something. This was from someone pressing her arm against those rails with significant force. Or worse, from someone restraining her against them. I looked at Mama Dot, who was watching me with those scared, pleading eyes. "Did someone hold you down?" I asked gently. "Did someone hurt you?" She nodded, emphatically. "Yes." "Did they press your arms against the bed rails?" Another nod. Her good hand moved in a gesture that suggested pulling, tying. She made a sound of frustration, trying so hard to tell me something she couldn't say in words. "Were they trying to keep you still? Restraining you?" "Yes." Nod. Tears. She was crying again, and so was I, because I understood now what had happened. Someone on staff, maybe an aide in a hurry, maybe a nurse who didn't have patience for a stroke patient who moved slowly or resisted care, had decided it was easier to force my mother's cooperation than to work with her at her own pace. They'd held her arms against the bed rails, maybe pressed them there while they changed her, or cleaned her, or repositioned her. And they'd done it hard enough to leave bruises that were still visible days later. I spent that evening documenting everything. I wrote down the date and time I discovered the bruises. I noted which nurse had been on duty and what she'd said. I documented Mama Dot's clear responses to my questions about whether someone had hurt her. I backed up all the photos to cloud storage and emailed copies to myself. Because I knew from other families' horror stories that nursing homes have a way of making evidence disappear, of altering records, of convincing families that they're overreacting. The next morning, I called Meadowview's administrative office and demanded an immediate meeting with the director of nursing and the facility administrator. They tried to schedule something for the following week. I told them I'd be there in 1 hour with my attorney on speakerphone, and if they couldn't accommodate that, my next call would be to the state health department and the local news station. They found time in their schedule. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room decorated with fake plants and motivational posters about compassionate care. The director of nursing was a woman named Patricia Holmes, white, probably late 50s, with the kind of professional demeanor that comes from years of managing problems and protecting the institution. The facility administrator was a man named David Chun, younger, clearly uncomfortable with confrontation. I laid the photos on the conference table like evidence at a crime scene. Close-ups of the bruises, photos showing the bed rails, the measurement comparisons, the documentation of my mother's responses to questions about being hurt. "Explain this," I said, keeping my voice level. "Explain how my mother, who can barely move her right side, accidentally got bruises that match the exact pattern of her bed rails. Explain how this is normal or unavoidable." Patricia picked up one of the photos, studied it, and I watched her face carefully. There was a flash of recognition, quickly masked. She'd seen injuries like this before. She knew what they meant. But when she spoke, her voice was calm and dismissive. "Mrs. Davis is a stroke patient with significant mobility limitations. During care, bathing, changing, repositioning, it's sometimes necessary to provide physical support and guidance. If a patient resists or moves unpredictably, they can bump against the bed rails or other equipment. The parallel pattern you're noting could easily result from her arm resting against the rails during a turning procedure." "Resting against the rails doesn't cause bruises this deep," I said. "Look at the color. Look at the clear imprint pattern. This is from sustained pressure. From force. Your mother has thin skin, and she's on blood thinners for stroke prevention, Patricia continued. Both of those factors make bruising more likely and more severe from even minor contact. What you're interpreting as evidence of force could simply be the result of her medical condition making normal care activities appear more traumatic than they actually were. My mother nodded yes when I asked if someone hurt her. She nodded yes when I asked if someone held her down. She's nonverbal, but she's not cognitively impaired. She knows what happened to her. David's chin shifted uncomfortably. With all due respect, interpreting the responses of a stroke patient can be complicated. Sometimes patients nod or make gestures that caregivers interpret in ways that align with their own concerns or fears, rather than what actually occurred. It's a form of confirmation bias. I felt rage building in my chest. They were going to gaslight me. They were going to use my mother's disability against her, suggesting she couldn't reliably communicate what had happened to her, that my documentation of her responses was suspect because I was looking for abuse rather than discovering it. So your position is that these injuries are accidental and unavoidable, and that my mother's communication about being hurt is unreliable? Our position, Patricia said carefully, is that we've reviewed the incident. Yes, we were aware of the bruising, and it was documented in her chart, and we found no evidence of improper care or staff misconduct. Your mother receives care from multiple staff members across multiple shifts. During one or more care interactions, she sustained minor injuries consistent with the physical handling required for someone with her level of disability. This is unfortunate but not uncommon. We've already implemented additional padding on her bed rails to prevent future contact bruising. You've implemented padding, I repeated slowly. So you acknowledge that the bed rails are the source of the injury? We acknowledge that contact with bed rails can cause bruising in patients with fragile skin, yes. And you acknowledge that this bruising happened during physical handling by your staff? During necessary care activities, yes. Then which staff member was involved? Who was on duty when this happened? I want names. Patricia's expression closed off. We can't provide you with staff names or scheduling information. That's confidential personnel information. What I can tell you is that we've reviewed the incident with all staff who provided care to your mother during the relevant time frame, and we've reinforced proper handling techniques. You've reinforced techniques, I said. You've added padding. But you're not admitting that someone was too rough with my mother. You're not admitting that someone held her arms against those rails hard enough to leave these marks. You're just covering your ass with vague corporate language while my mother is lying in that room, terrified of the people who are supposed to be caring for her. Mrs. Davis, David Chun said, his voice taking on a warning tone. I understand you're upset, but making accusations of abuse without evidence is serious. It's defamatory to our staff, and it creates a hostile environment that makes it difficult for us to provide care to your mother. I have evidence, I said, tapping the photos. Right here. Evidence that your staff's physical handling of my mother was forceful enough to cause injury. Evidence that the pattern of injury matches restraint against bed rails. And evidence that my mother is afraid of specific staff members, which suggests this wasn't a one-time accident. What you have, Patricia said coldly, is photos of bruising that can be explained by routine care interactions complicated by your mother's medical conditions. What you don't have is any witness testimony, any video evidence, or any documentation of improper conduct by our staff. You have your interpretation of ambiguous physical findings, and your interpretation of your mother's limited communication. That's not the same as proof of abuse. Then get me the video, I said. You have cameras in the hallways. Get me the footage from the nights before these bruises appeared. Let me see who was entering and exiting my mother's room and how they were interacting with her. Patricia and David exchanged a look. Our security footage is for internal use only, David said. We don't release it to families without a court order or a directive from law enforcement. So you won't let me see the footage that might prove what happened to my mother? We've reviewed the footage internally as part of our investigation, Patricia said, and we found nothing that indicated improper care. You reviewed it, the same people whose staff are accused of hurting my mother, and you found nothing wrong. How convenient. The meeting ended badly. They refused to provide staff names, refused to let me see video footage, refused to admit that anything improper had occurred. They offered to move Mama to a different room for everyone's comfort and suggested that perhaps I should consider whether Meadowview is the right fit for our family. It was a subtle threat. Stop making trouble, or we'll make it clear that your mother isn't welcome here anymore. I left that meeting knowing I couldn't trust Meadowview to investigate themselves or to be honest with me about what was happening to my mother. So I decided to do what they clearly didn't want me to do. I started my own investigation. First, I changed my visiting schedule. Instead of coming every evening at the same predictable time, I started showing up randomly. Early morning before breakfast, mid-afternoon, late evening after visiting hours were technically over, claiming I'd left something in Mama Dot's room and needed to retrieve it. I wanted to see what happened when staff didn't know family was watching. What I observed made my blood run cold. The level of care my mother received varied dramatically depending on which staff members were on duty and whether family members were present. When I was there, or when other families were visiting their loved ones, aides and nurses were patient, gentle, taking their time with care tasks. But during the shifts when few family members were around, particularly night shift and early mornings, the care became rushed, rough, impersonal. I watched an aide, the same Brittany that Mama seemed afraid of, enter my mother's room one morning at 6 a.m. when she didn't know I was there. I'd arrived early and was sitting quietly in the corner of the dim room. Brittany came in without knocking, turned on the harsh overhead lights without warning, and announced loudly, "Time to get up, Dorothy. Let's get you changed." She pulled the blankets off roughly, startling Mama Dot awake. Then she grabbed my mother's right arm, the one with the bruises, the one that was still painful, and pulled her into a sitting position without any of the gentle support or verbal warnings that best practices require for stroke patients. Mama Dot made a sound of pain and distress. Brittany ignored it. "Come on, work with me," Brittany said impatiently. "I've got 20 more people to get through this morning. Stop being so stiff." She yanked Mama Dot's nightgown off, handling her like she was a mannequin instead of a person. When Mama Dot's body involuntarily resisted, because stroke patients often have muscle stiffness they can't control, Brittany grabbed her arms and shoved them against the bed rails to hold them still while she cleaned her. The exact position that would create the bruise pattern I documented. I stood up from the corner. "Excuse me." Brittany jumped, clearly startled. "Oh, I didn't know anyone was here." "You're here early." "I can see that," I said coldly. "And I just watched you handle my mother roughly enough to hurt her. You grabbed her injured arm, you didn't warn her before moving her, and you shoved her arms against the bed rails. That's not appropriate care." "I was just doing my job," Brittany said defensively. "Some patients are resistant in the morning, and you have to be firm with them, or you'll never get through your assignments. You have to be firm, or you have to be gentle and patient with stroke patients who can't control their muscle stiffness. There's a difference between providing support and forcing compliance. Look, I don't have time for this. If you think you can do better, you're welcome to stay here all day and do her care yourself." She left before I could respond, leaving Mama Dot half-dressed and crying. I finished helping her get dressed, speaking softly, moving slowly, the way you're supposed to treat someone with a disability. The way Brittany had been trained to do but couldn't be bothered to do when she thought no one was watching. I reported the incident to the director of nursing immediately. Patricia listened with a neutral expression and promised to address it with staff. But nothing changed. Brittany continued working on Mama Dot's unit, continued providing care, continued being rough when she thought families weren't looking. Next, I started talking to other families. I hung around the common areas during visiting hours, struck up conversations with other Black families whose loved ones were on the same unit as Mama Dot. The stories I heard were eerily similar. An elderly man in room 308 had mysterious bruises that staff blamed on falling in his wheelchair. His daughter had noticed that the bruise pattern matched the wheelchair's armrests, suggesting he'd been forcibly held down during transfers. A woman in room 315 had become terrified of a particular male aide who her family suspected was being rough during bathroom transfers. She started refusing to eat or drink to avoid needing the bathroom, resulting in a UTI and hospitalization. A man in room 319 had bite marks on his arm that staff claimed were self-inflicted, even though he had advanced Parkinson's and couldn't bring his hands to his mouth with that kind of coordination or force. The pattern was clear. Nonverbal or limited communication residents, predominantly Black and brown elders, were experiencing what looked like physical abuse. And when families raised concerns, they were met with medical explanations that blamed the residents' conditions rather than investigating staff conduct. I also discovered something else: restraints. During one of my late evening visits, I was looking for Mama Dot's missing slippers and opened the drawer of her bedside table. Inside, underneath some facility-issued socks, I found soft fabric ties, the kind that look like bandages but are used to secure patients' arms or legs to bed rails or wheelchair arms. Restraints are heavily regulated in nursing homes. They can only be used with a doctor's order, with family consent, and only as a last resort for safety when someone is in immediate danger of hurting themselves or others. Mama Dot had none of those authorizations. So why were restraints in her drawer? I took photos of them, then confronted the evening nurse about their presence. She looked flustered and said they were probably left over from a previous resident and shouldn't be there. But that explanation didn't make sense. Mama Dot had been in this room for 3 months. Why would previous residents' supplies still be in the drawer? Unless staff were using them on Mama Dot without authorization. Unless those accidental bruises weren't from bumping against bed rails at all, but from having her arms tied to them. That possibility made me physically sick. My gentle, helpless mother being tied down like an animal. Being restrained during care because staff didn't want to take the time to work patiently with her limitations. Being trapped and terrified with no way to call for help or tell anyone what was being done to her. I knew then that I had to get her out of Meadowview immediately. But I also knew I needed more proof before I made formal reports, because without it, the facility would just deny everything and no one would face consequences. So I made a decision that I'm still not sure was legal, but I'd do it again in a heartbeat. I installed a hidden camera in Mama Dot's room. It was a small device disguised as a digital clock, positioned on the windowsill with a view of the bed. I told myself I'd only use the footage if I discovered actual abuse, that I was just trying to keep my mother safe. Florida's law on recording in nursing homes is murky. It's technically legal to record in a shared space if you're the resident or their legal representative, but staff have privacy rights too. I was risking a lawsuit, but I was more afraid of my mother being hurt than I was of legal consequences. For 3 nights, the camera recorded nothing alarming. Routine nighttime checks, medication administration, brief interactions that seemed normal if rushed. I started to wonder if maybe I was being paranoid, if maybe the bruising really had been an unfortunate accident rather than deliberate abuse. Then came the 4th night. The night shift from hell that would give me all the evidence I needed and haunt my nightmares forever. The footage showed Brittany entering Mama Dot's room around 2 a.m. My mother was asleep. Brittany turned on the bright overhead light and roughly shook Mama Dot awake. "Time to turn," she announced. "Let's go." Turning patients every 2 hours is standard care to prevent bed sores. But the way Brittany did it was anything but standard. Instead of explaining what she was doing, instead of giving Mama Dot time to wake up and cooperate, Brittany grabbed her arms and yanked her onto her side. Mama Dot cried out, a wordless sound of pain and fear that broke my heart when I watched the video later. "Stop fighting me," Brittany snapped. Even though Mama Dot wasn't fighting, she was just stiff and disoriented from being jerked awake. "I don't have time for this." Then, and this is the part that made me scream when I watched it, Brittany grabbed the fabric ties from the bedside drawer. She looped one around Mama Dot's left wrist and tied it to the bed rail. Then she did the same with the right wrist, pulling the ties tight enough that Mama Dot's arms were stretched out and secured against the rails. My mother was crying, making those frustrated sounds that meant she was trying to speak, trying to protest. Brittany ignored her. She finished turning Mama Dot, which really just meant leaving her on her side with her arms tied to the rails so she couldn't move, and then left the room. The timestamp showed she was gone for 47 minutes before returning to untie the restraints and turn Mama Dot onto her back again. 47 minutes. My mother spent 47 minutes tied to bed rails in the dark, unable to move, unable to call for help, unable to do anything except lie there crying while circulation was cut off to her wrists, and her arms were pressed against the metal bars hard enough to leave the bruises I'd photographed days earlier. I watched that footage at 3 a.m. in my living room, and I vomited. I physically could not handle what I was seeing. The casual cruelty of it. The way Brittany had treated my mother like an inconvenient object to be secured, so she wouldn't have to come back and check on her. The way my mother's cries had been completely ignored. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours until dawn backing up the video footage to multiple locations, cloud storage, external hard drive, email attachments to my attorney and to myself. I documented everything. Timestamps, descriptions of what the video showed, screenshots of the clearest moments when the restraints were visible and when Mama Dot's distress was obvious. At 6 a.m., I called my attorney. At 7 a.m., I called the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration to file an immediate complaint. At 8 a.m., I called the local police department to report elder abuse. And at 9 a.m., I walked into Meadowview Care Center with a printed copy of the most damning screenshots from the video and demanded to see David Chun and Patricia Holmes immediately. They tried to make me wait. I told the receptionist loudly, loud enough for other families in the lobby to hear, that I had video evidence of staff restraining my mother without authorization and that if they didn't meet with me in the next 5 minutes, I would be sharing that video with the local news station and posting it on every social media platform I could access. They found time for me. This time, my attorney was physically present, not just on speakerphone. David and Patricia enter the conference room, looking annoyed but not yet worried. That changed the moment I slid a screenshot across the table, showing Brittany tying my mother's wrist to the bed rail. "Explain this," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "Explain why your aide is restraining my mother without a doctor's order, without family consent, without any authorization whatsoever. Explain why the bruises I showed you last week, the ones you called accidental, were actually from my mother being tied to bed rails for close to an hour while she cried and couldn't call for help." Patricia went pale. David stared at the photo, then looked up at me with the dawning realization that they were in serious legal trouble. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "I installed a camera in my mother's room, which is legal under Florida law because I'm her designated healthcare proxy, and she's unable to consent for herself. And that camera recorded your employee restraining my mother illegally on multiple occasions." "You can't record our staff without their consent," Patricia said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. "That's a violation of their privacy rights. Staff have limited privacy expectations when they're providing care in a resident's private room," my attorney interjected, "especially when there are reasonable concerns about the quality and safety of that care. The video evidence is admissible, and I can assure you that the state investigators who are already on their way to inspect this facility will be very interested in viewing it." David's face had gone from annoyed to panicked. "State investigators? I filed a complaint with AHCA this morning," I said. "Formal allegations of elder abuse, unauthorized use of restraints, falsification of care records, and retaliation against a family member for reporting concerns. They take those allegations seriously, especially when there's video evidence." "Let's not be hasty," David stammered. "I'm sure we can resolve this without involving regulators. If there was an incident where staff used inappropriate techniques, we can address it internally. We can terminate the employee involved, provide additional training, offer compensation." "You had a chance to address it internally," I said coldly. 2 weeks ago when I showed you photos of bruises that matched bed rail patterns. You told me it was accidental. You told me I was misinterpreting my mother's communication. You refused to provide staff names or video footage. You gaslit me, and you lied to protect your staff and your facility's reputation. So no, we're not resolving this internally. This is going to state investigators, law enforcement, and if I have my way, the media." Patricia found her voice again, though it was strained. "If we did fail to properly investigate your initial concerns, we apologize. We take all allegations of abuse seriously, and we clearly fell short of our standards in this case. We're prepared to take immediate corrective action. The aide in question will be suspended, pending a full investigation. We'll conduct a comprehensive review of our restraint policies and training. We'll provide your mother with alternative care arrangements." "Alternative arrangements?" I interrupted. "You mean the same thing you offered 2 weeks ago? Moving her to a different room in the same facility with the same staff and the same culture that allowed this to happen?" "No. I'm transferring my mother out of this facility today. I've already arranged emergency placement at another facility with better supervision and a track record of actual transparency." "You can't just remove her without proper notice," David objected. We require 30 days written notice of discharge, and I can absolutely remove her immediately under Florida Statute 400.022 when there's been abuse or neglect," my attorney said smoothly. "Any attempt to prevent Mrs. Williams from transferring her mother will be documented as additional evidence of retaliation and obstruction. I strongly suggest you focus on cooperating with the state investigation rather than trying to keep Mrs. Davis here against the family's wishes." The meeting ended with Meadowview agreeing to facilitate an immediate transfer, to preserve all records related to Mama Dot's care, including the restraints I'd found and photographed, and to cooperate fully with state investigators. They didn't admit wrongdoing, facilities never do, but their willingness to agree to everything we demanded told me they knew exactly how damaging that video was. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, Mama Dot was in an ambulance being transported to New Hope Care Community, a smaller facility I'd vetted extensively. By 5 p.m., state investigators were at Meadowview interviewing staff and reviewing records. By 8 p.m. that evening, local news had picked up the story. Hidden camera reveals alleged elder abuse at local nursing home. The investigation took 4 months. During that time, I learned things about Meadowview that made me sick. The restraint use wasn't isolated to Brittany or to my mother. Multiple aides have been using unauthorized restraints as shortcuts during care, particularly on nonverbal residents who couldn't report the abuse. Management had received previous complaints about rough handling and had dismissed them all, just like they dismissed mine. The state investigation found multiple violations: unauthorized use of restraints, failure to implement abuse prevention policies, inadequate supervision of staff, falsification of care records, they'd never documented the restraint use or the injuries it caused, and retaliation against families who raised concerns. That part was about me and 2 other families who'd complained and been threatened with discharge. Meadowview was fined $75,000 and placed on probation. Their administrator, David Chun, was forced to resign. 3 aides, including Brittany, were terminated and reported to the state registry, which would prevent them from working in healthcare again. Brittany also faced criminal charges for elder abuse, misdemeanor charges, not felony, which felt like a slap on the wrist for what she'd done, but at least it was something. The local news coverage was extensive. The video I'd captured, edited to protect my mother's privacy but still clearly showing the restraint and neglect, went viral in elder care advocacy circles. I did interviews with local stations and with national elder abuse prevention organizations. I wanted people to know what could happen behind closed doors in facilities with good ratings and nice lobbies and friendly admission coordinators. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of families reached out with their own stories of mysterious bruises, suspicious injuries, and loved ones who seemed afraid of staff but couldn't communicate why. Many of them hadn't reported because they didn't think they'd be believed, or because they didn't know how to prove what was happening, or because facilities had convinced them it was normal for elderly people to get hurt. But it's not normal. It's never normal. And the evidence is often hiding in plain sight if you know what to look for. Mama Dot has been at New Hope Care Community for 8 months now, and the difference is remarkable. She's no longer afraid. She doesn't flinch when staff approach her bed. She doesn't have mysterious bruises appearing on her body every few days. The staff here move slowly, speak gently, take their time with care tasks. They treat her like a person with dignity rather than an object to be managed as efficiently as possible. She's even regained a little speech. Not much, the stroke damage is permanent, but she can say a few words now. Yes, no, love you, hurt. That last one breaks my heart every time, because I know it's a word she learned at Meadowview. A word she needed and didn't have when people were hurting her and she couldn't tell anyone. I think about those bruises constantly, about how the spacing matched the bed rails, about how obvious it should have been that those injuries weren't accidental, about how many times staff and administrators looked at that evidence and chose to lie rather than investigate, about how many other families are looking at suspicious injuries right now and being told elderly people bruise easily, or it's normal, or you're being paranoid. Because that's what abusive facilities count on. Families not knowing what evidence looks like. Families trusting that medical professionals wouldn't lie about injuries. Families feeling too intimidated or too guilty to push back when their concerns are dismissed. But here's what I learned through this nightmare. The evidence is there if you look for it. And there are patterns to recognize. When bruises have clear shapes, fingerprints, grip marks, straight lines, they're not from random bumps. They're from being grabbed or restrained. When injuries have precise spacing or match patterns in the environment, bed rails, wheelchair parts, grab bars, that tells you something about how they occurred and whether the accident explanation makes sense. When a nonverbal loved one shows fear around specific staff members, that's not confusion or paranoia. That's communication. Believe it. When facilities get defensive instead of concerned about injuries, when they make you feel like you're the problem for asking questions, when they refuse to provide information or access to records, those are red flags that something is being hidden. I made mistakes during this process. I trusted too long. I let myself be convinced that I was overreacting. I didn't install that camera until weeks after the abuse had started, which means I'll never know how many times Mama was restrained or hurt before I caught it on video. Those mistakes haunt me, but I also did some things right. I documented everything obsessively. I took photos from multiple angles with measurements clearly visible. I noted dates, times, and which staff were on duty. I kept copies of everything in multiple locations so evidence couldn't disappear. I talked to other families and found patterns that show the abuse wasn't isolated. I got legal help early instead of trying to handle everything myself. And when the facility tried to intimidate me into silence, I escalated instead of backing down. Those actions made the difference between being dismissed as a difficult family member and actually getting justice for my mother. The legal case is still ongoing. We filed a civil lawsuit against Meadowview for the abuse and cover-up. The facility's insurance company has made settlement offers, but we're pushing for more than money. We want policy changes written into the settlement agreement. Requirements for family access to care records and video footage. Mandatory reporting of all injuries with photographic documentation. Regular independent audits of restraint use. Consequences for staff and administrators who retaliate against families for reporting concerns. Because money doesn't undo what happened to Mama. Money doesn't give her back the nights she spent tied to bed rails, terrified and in pain. Money doesn't erase the trauma that made her afraid to drink water or afraid to ask for help. But policy changes might protect the next family. Transparency requirements might make it harder for facilities to hide abuse. Accountability measures might make staff think twice before taking dangerous shortcuts. I've also become an advocate. I work with the state long-term care ombudsman program now, helping other families investigate suspected abuse. I teach workshops on recognizing injury patterns, documenting evidence, and navigating the complaint process. I push for legislative changes that would strengthen protections for nonverbal residents and increase penalties for facilities that use unauthorized restraints. The work is heartbreaking. Every week I hear new stories of elders being hurt by people paid to care for them. Every week I see photos of bruises that families are being told are accidental but clearly aren't. Every week I watch families struggle with guilt and fear and helplessness because they can't protect their loved ones from systems that prioritize efficiency and profit over human dignity. But occasionally there are victories. Families who catch abuse early because they recognize the patterns I taught them to look for. Facilities that implement real reforms because they fear public scrutiny. Staff who are held accountable for violence they thought they could commit without consequences. And that's what keeps me going. The knowledge that Mama's suffering wasn't meaningless. That the evidence we gathered and the fight we waged are helping other vulnerable elders. That other families won't have to watch their mothers cry silently because they're being hurt and can't tell anyone. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on all notifications for more true stories about recognizing and documenting elder abuse, understanding your rights as a family advocate, and fighting back when facilities try to cover up neglect. If this story opened your eyes, if you're going to check your own loved one for suspicious injuries tonight, leave a heart in the comments below. Tell me what city you're watching from. Share your stories if you're comfortable. Because the more we talk about this, the harder it becomes for abusive facilities to operate in silence. The more families know what to look for, the more lives we can save. I want to end with a specific warning. Check your loved one's body. I know it feels invasive. I know they might be embarrassed, or you might feel uncomfortable. Do it anyway. Look at their arms, their legs, their back, their wrists, their ankles. Look for bruises, scratches, cuts, pressure marks, rope burns. Take photos of anything suspicious. Measure spacing if there are patterns. Compare injuries to equipment in their environment. And if you find something that doesn't look accidental, don't let anyone tell you it's normal. Don't let staff make you feel like you're being paranoid or difficult. Trust your eyes. Trust your instincts. Document everything and escalate until someone takes you seriously. Because the bruises don't lie. The measurements don't lie. The patterns don't lie. And when your nonverbal loved one shows fear or pain, they're not confused. They're communicating the only way they can. Believe them. The bed rails that were supposed to keep Mama safe became weapons used against her. The care that was supposed to help her became a source of trauma. The facility that promised dignity delivered violence and covered it up with medical terminology and corporate lies. But the evidence was there all along. In the precise spacing of parallel bruises, in the way the marks matched the rails exactly, in my mother's tears and fear that everyone dismissed as confusion. We almost missed it. I almost believed the lies. I almost accepted that elderly people bruise easily and moved on. And if I had, Mama would still be at Meadowview, still being restrained, still being hurt, still unable to tell anyone what was being done to her. That thought wakes me up at night sometimes. The knowledge of how close we came to leaving her there. How close we came to letting the abuse continue simply because I didn't know what to look for or how to prove it. So I'm telling you now, look, measure, document, believe, advocate, fight. Because somewhere right now, another mother is being restrained against bed rails. Another family is being told that suspicious injuries are normal. Another facility is counting on families not knowing what evidence looks like or not having the courage to challenge medical authority. Don't let them get away with it. Don't let your loved one suffer in silence. The bruises are speaking. The patterns are screaming. The evidence is there. You just have to be willing to see it. And once you see it, you have to be willing to fight like hell to protect the person who can't protect themselves. Mama's bruises match the bed rails. That measurement, that undeniable mathematical proof, is what broke through the lies and forced accountability. What patterns are waiting to be measured in your loved one's room? What evidence are you not seeing yet? What story is their body trying to tell you? Look tonight. Just look. It might save their life.